this week's Parshat Naso, and we've taken a break for a while. I don't even know the last time where I did something connected to the Parsha. It's definitely been a while. But we're going to return to the Parsha tonight, and specifically we're going to discuss the idea of Nazir. And I'll explain what the questions are in a second. I just want to dedicate the shiur to a friend of mine. His name is Penny Schechter. I'll just say that he helped me to understand the idea of Nazir a little bit more, and therefore I thought I'd dedicate the shiur to him. And we know the basic idea behind the Nazir. Right, a Nazir. Right, there are three main things that a Nazir does differently. Right, what are the things? What makes a Nazir unique or different?
Can't drink wine.
Right, can't drink wine, and all the other great things. Can't cut their hair.
Can't be tamei lamet.
And they can't become tamei lamet. And it's a strange combination. It's a very, very strange combination. Some of the things are like a kohen. Right, a kohen is not allowed to be tamei lamet. A kohen, in fact, just like a kohen gadol, even they're not allowed to become in contact with their immediate relatives. In other words, regular kohen can become tamei for immediate relatives. Kohen gadol cannot. It's the same thing with a nazir. You can maybe add in the fact that they can't drink wine. Well, kohanim can certainly drink wine, but kohanim can't drink wine when they're doing the avodah. So maybe on some level it's kohen-like, kohen gadol-like. But at the same time, what's the idea with the growing the hair long? That's actually kind of seems the opposite of a kohen, right? A kohen actually has to get their hair cut. In fact, even when they become, even when he becomes an avel, they're not allowed to let their hair grow long. So it's it's an odd combination. It's a very, very odd combination. And then there's all these, we'll see the halachot that get added on make it even stranger, which we'll get to it in the separate part. But there's all these korbanot that have to be brought at the end. It talks about the chait that he's done, which is very strange. He doesn't seem to have done any chait at all. This is all, by the way, this is Naso Perek Vav. He doesn't seem to have really done any chait. And it talks about what happens if he becomes tamei by mistake and whatever it is. But there's all these korbanot. When he finishes up, he has to bring an olah, he has to bring a chatat, he has to bring a shlamim, one from each of the major categories. Just the whole thing is just very, very strange. And the question would be, why would a person want to take this on? What's the goal of being a Nazir? And even we can ask, is it a positive thing? I mean, it's a very strange thing. It's certainly something that separates you. And one of the things I think that's very, very important, I've stressed this from time to time, but I'm going to stress it a little bit more, is that when we ask any of these kind of questions, we're going to answer them very differently depending on the era in which we live. Meaning that, in other words, we don't read any text objectively. In other words, we don't just read it without any preconceived notions. Depending on when we live, we're affected by certain ideas of things. I mean, all our beliefs, we don't really think about this, but things we believe that we just think are normal are actually very much dependent on when you live, where you live. So, it's not as if you could really come up with the answer to this question. Each answer that we're going to give, or each approach that we're going to give, is really going to say at least as much about the people who are saying it as much as about the thing itself. So, just for example, I want to start off. You both noticed this. This is a translation with a commentary. It's by a professor who I think is still alive. I didn't get a chance to look it up. His name is Robert Alter. He's a professor at University of California, Berkeley, which of course means he's not a right winger. Probably in terms of politics, you can't really be at Berkeley and be right wing. But he's a very interesting professor. In other words, he was he's written a lot on Bible. It's not just a translation, and there's no such thing as just a translation. Translating is not an easy thing. Trying to get the meaning correct and paying attention to the language, and it's not a simple thing. But he's done quite a bit. And what makes him interesting is that, as with many Bible professors, you could certainly get into the bigger questions of, do they believe that this, the Torah comes from God? But his approach is sort of like whoever wrote it, however it was written, you can read these things sort of like in a literary sort of way. So he kind of asks a lot of interesting questions that are the kind of questions that Mefarshim ask. And so I wanted to bring him. Obviously, he's not writing in the era of when the Torah was given, 3,000 plus years ago, but he's writing with a perspective which I think adds to that. And it's one of the things that's always interesting to think about. And it's always one of these things, one day, I don't know, I probably won't, but I could pretend that one day what I'd love to do is really, really deeply study ancient Egypt. Because I'm convinced that many parts of the Torah, and particularly parts of the Torah that seem very strange to us, if we understood the culture of the Jews at that time, it would make a lot of sense. Meaning that, in other words, when we have this principle, Dibrat Torah Kol Shon Bnei Adam, that the Torah speaks in human language, most specifically, it would speak to the people who it was given to. So, in other words, if we read a book from 200 years ago, or we read Shakespeare, or we read, something written, in the time, any of the Greek, anything, the Greek plays or literature. There's a lot we have to miss. It's just because, again, writers always, you put in, imagine 300 years from now, and lahavdil, I won't say lahavdil, elef havdalas, because Simpsons is not exactly completely unholy, but imagine if someone watched The Simpsons 300 years from now, right? In other words, they would probably laugh a lot, but they probably wouldn't laugh as much as we do, because there's all sorts of jokes which are written for a person who's living in the 21st century that a person living 300 years ago just, you wouldn't get. So in other words, the same thing, the havdil over here, that when a person, when you read the story of Tanakh, it's being given to people who are leaving Egypt. So there's all sorts of references that are going to make sense to them that we're not going to pick up on. Just little words that might be a play on words or something that they knew, or images or ideas. And it's one of the things that just is very interesting is that a lot, I think this is very true in general with Egypt, but in terms of general ancient culture. So I just want to throw a couple of things that I'm going to read two things that he writes. And again, even the very first pasuk, the first pasukim of the parak are a little challenging, right? It says V'daber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Okay, fine, that's not so challenging. But then the second pasuk, Daber al bnei Yisrael v'martel lehem ish o isha. Ki yafli lindor neder Nazir lahazir laHashem. Right. So first of all, they always tell the famous story where the Rosh Yeshiva is interviewing a yeshiva bachar and says, can you prove to me that a woman can be a Nazir? And he starts trying to bring all these gemarot and all these proofs, and it's not a mitzvah seishas man grama. And the real answer is what it says in the pasuk, Daber b'nei Yisrael martel lehem ish o isha. It says it could be a man or a woman, which maybe is an important detail, but okay, fine. Then it says ki yafli, again pei lamed aleph pela, which again he'll pick up on a second when he will pei lamed aleph. We'll leave that untranslated. Lindor neder Nazir, to make a Nazir vow, lahazir laHashem. Okay, so let's see how we translate this. He says. Okay, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, fine, speak to the Israelites and say to them, man or woman, should anyone act exceptionally, right? Pela, right? Nifla, right? Should a man act exceptionally to make a Nazirite vow to keep himself apart for the Lord? Okay, and then he goes to what it is. Now, so he says as follows. He says, much of the biblical view of the institution of Nazir depends on the interpretation of the word yafli, right? In other words, if we want to try to understand what the Torah's view is of the Nazir, it depends on what this word, again, this shorish with pei lamed aleph, what it's going to mean, that is used here. Some modern commentators make it relatively neutral by claiming that the conjunction with vow, it merely means to state the vow expressly. That in other words, he will express a vow. In other words, it's not really a judgment word, it's just a word with a vow. Then he goes on. He says, not so likely this is true. Then he says, some medieval commentators, whom Levine follows, I don't know who Baruch Levine is, but he's quoting him, fine, understand it as a synonymous reinforcer of the reiterated word hazir, to set apart. Assume that the word pei lamed is connected to pei lamed hey, which does mean to set apart, to distinguish, right? Like sometimes you could have, right, pei lamed hey could sometimes mean to set apart. But the common biblical use of pei lamed is in the sense of performing a wonder or acting in a way that is profuse or extraordinary. right? Pella, wondrous, right? He quotes this is from the Ibn Ezra. In other words, it seems to be saying that there's something that this man or woman who's accepting upon themselves this the vow to become a Nazir, they're doing something wondrous or extraordinary, which we could just translate not in wow, that's extraordinary, but that's not typical, right? Which is literally what extraordinary means. If that is the most likely meaning, then the biblical legislator, yikes, sees the person who assumes these obligations of self-restriction as doing something extraordinary. Whether this extraordinary act is viewed with admiration or suspicion is not entirely clear. In other words, the word Pella indicates that he's doing something not typical. But not typical is not always good. I mean, not typical if I go and, save a person's life, that's not typical. And also if I, try to walk across, the Brooklyn Bridge on the rail without falling, that's also not typical, but that's, it's certainly not ordinary, but it's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, you might say I'm a fool. So he's just saying that, in other words, it's not clear from the context. I mean, he's saying that inherently within the pasuk itself, it's not clear. Does the Torah even consider being a Nazir a good thing or not? And we'll see in the Chazal, we're going to pick up on this. It's not clear from Chazal whether it's a good thing. In other words, they're saying this is something a person may do. He or she may become a Nazir, and there's a process if you do it. But is it good? Should you want to do it? Is it something that ideally a person would do? Okay, all right, and then he continues. And again, so again, in terms of wine, we can think about, right, what would be an idea? Why would someone want to do something that involves refraining from wine? Right?
Not be intoxicated.
Right, not to be intoxicated. Okay, right, makes sense. There's value in theory, right, to think clearly, to not allow, we know stories from Tanakh that wine plays a negative role in many stories, right? For example, with Noach, right, Noach comes out of the teva and gets drunk, and then bad stuff happened with him. According to some explanations, Nadav and Avihu, they brought the Torah when they were drunk. Certainly, if you look in later books of Nach, being drunk is not a positive thing. So that could be one thing. But the thing that he comes up with, what about again? And again, the strangest thing. Okay, staying away from being a mate. Again, maybe you want to be like a Kohen Gadol. But what's the deal with the hair thing? It's very strange. So he brings down something that's very interesting. Right, he says as follows. He says, allowing the hair to grow uncut has been the subject of much anthropological speculation. In other words, where did this come from back then? The simplest inference is that it served as a very visible outward sign of the Nazarites being set apart. And here's something interesting, that it could become a product of the body you could actually offer up on the altar. Right? In other words, think about it. Other parts of your body you would not be able to sacrifice. You could, but it would be a very, very painful process. In other words, the only part that, I guess you could, I don't know, spit, blood. But the only, natural part of your body that you could easily do is by letting your hair grow. And that is one of the things that happens at the end, is that it actually, when he stops being a Nazir, he or she, they cut their hair and they burn it on the altar. So there could be some sort of an idea, and maybe we'll touch on this a bit, of wanting to give of yourself. Right? In other words, we spoke about it, a few weeks ago about the idea of a korban and what it means to give a korban, and trying to give over and trying to connect. On some level, a person might want to give themselves, right? In extreme, sometimes we'll give a substitute, right? We'll give an animal instead of ourselves. We'll give over some of our wealth. In really crazy, extreme situations, a person might even try to give their child, right? But you'd want to give of yourself. But of course, you don't want to ultimately of yourself, because you want to be around to benefit from the sacrifice. So he's saying, so maybe on some level, the cutting of the hair, it's the one thing that you can do that you can give literally of yourself.
Yeah. Do you know of any other instances where Jews sacrifice their hair?
No. So that's the thing. There are none. But what he points out that's interesting here, and again, this gets back to an interesting idea in general. This is almost like Rambam-esque, right? Remember the Rambam says by Korbanot that they really were not something ideal, but God saw that the Jews were coming out of Egypt, and they saw that this is the way the people were living, and they wanted to do it. So he points out something very interesting here. Now again, the dating is going to be off, but he might not believe that the Torah was written when we believe the Torah was written. But he says a late 9th century BCE Phoenician inscription, although maybe you could say that even if it was found on the 9th century one, it could be that this reflects like an earlier practice. But there was this Phoenician inscription, seems to reflect an offering of hair to Astarte. I don't know who that god was, or even if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But in other words, what he finds is that there was this concept there, at least at least in the 9th century BCE, and one guesses it probably goes back earlier than that there was a concept of trying to give of yourself. So maybe on some level, maybe the part of the korban is just trying to give over oneself. So in other words, just from a plain reading of the Torah, we don't really have a sense whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. Yafli, Pella, it's certainly wondrous, it's unique, it's out of the ordinary. The average person has no problem becoming tamei. The average person has no problem drinking wine. And the average person cuts their hair whenever they feel like it. And yet this person doesn't do it. So just it's interesting thing just to point out from a Torah perspective, if you were living at the time, it's not so clear from just what we have over here whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's unique. It is maybe a little bit Kohen-like. Again, as I said, it does still talk about you're doing kapara at the end, which again, for what? What are you atoning for? And why are you giving a korban chatat, which is usually for a sin? So Chazal are going to pick up on some of these things, but at least from a pure, if we're looking at it, a person living 3,000 years ago, if you heard this, and without any more context than at least what we know of this, it's not so clear why anybody would do this or what it's really about. So, Chazal, and again, that's not the greatest phrase to ever use, because it's not as if there was like one rabbi or a position of the rabbis. But the rabbis try to unload a whole bunch of different things, right? So for example, right, there are certain dinim which are not mentioned in the Torah, but which the chahchamim added on, or pointed out, or however we want to understand it. So for example, and I'm going to use the Torah Shlema rather than makes it that I can carry around a fewer books. So for example, and again, I'm trying to use this, almost like we're detectives, like we're trying to figure out what exactly, what's the picture that they're painting? What are they trying to get at? So, for example, it's at the beginning when it says Daber el Bnei Yisrael, it says Hakutim ein lahem nazirut. Right, hakutim, which is maybe use a different word, but in general, what the Gemara means is that non-Jews cannot become a Nazir. Within the Torah system, it is a specifically Jewish concept. Now, whether we like this conception or not, and it might not be so popular, but when you think about it, there's the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, and there's the Taryag mitzvot. And there's a very, very big difference. The Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach are not about holiness. In other words, they're basic, right? Aver min achai, you shouldn't be cruel in terms of eating an animal before it dies. Birkat Hashem, you shouldn't be rebellious against God and curse God. Gezel, you shouldn't steal. Basic morality, dinim, you should have courts. And then the big three, murder. You commit murder. You shouldn't have sexual immorality, and you shouldn't practice avodah zarah. They're not about kedusha. It's about creating order in the world. On the other hand, the Taryag mitzvot are about a lot more than that, right? In other words, as people have pointed out, you can be a good person without keeping all the Torah, right? You can be a good person and still wear a kilayim. Clearly the Torah is about more than just keeping order. It's more than about being not being, just being a basically moral kind of person. So the fact, if we put that together, the fact that they're saying that non-Jews cannot be Nazir, that Jews can, it seems to be that Chazal are understanding this as something that has to do with holiness. Because again, the fact that again it's being set aside as specifically, something for Jews to do as opposed to non-Jews. And we can even throw in, what I said before, the fact that it's for men and women as well. In other words, if it's about raising oneself up, right, it's about trying to achieve some sort of level, the fact that it's for men and women, then in other words, even though men and women might not have the same ways of getting there, but in general we want to make sure that men and women both have the opportunity to get to the finish line. So in other words, it certainly seems, again, both the fact that non-Jews cannot become Nazirim, and the fact that it's men and women, that it does seem to be something about a person who's trying to, raise up their level. I'm going to read to you, again, a series of various midrashim that give you, again, this sense of, to what degree Chazal were very conflicted as to whether this is a good thing. One second. I think it's on the next page. So the Midrash, this is from Masechet Ta'anit, says as follows. Amar Shmuel, Kol hayoshev b'ta'anit nikra chotei. Anyone who voluntarily takes on a fast is called a sinner. Shneimar v'chiper alav masher chata al hanefesh. Right, quoting from a pasuk from here, and he shall atone for the sin that he did. And now the Gemara asks, "V'chi be'ezen nefesh chatazeh." What sin did the Nazir do that he has to make up for his sin? Ela shetzier atzmo min hayayin. Right? What was his sin? He kept himself from having wine. Right? The Tani Rabbi Lezer Kapar Rabbi Omer Matamul Omer v'chaper alav masher chatal nefesh v'chi be'ezen nefesh chatazeh. What's the sin? Ela shetzier atzmo min hayayin v'alo dvarim kal v'chomer. We can make a kal v'chomer. If a person who only held back from one part of God's world, from wine, is considered a sinner, all the more so, you're a sinner if you fast, right? In other words, what it seems to be saying is that God created this world. You have all these positive things, these valuable things that God allowed you to do. Why are you saying you're not going to do it? Right? In other words, there's value. God forbade enough from us in this world. Why would you take on something extra? So it's saying, if he's called a sinner just for not having wine, then for sure a person who decides to fast and only not have wine but not have fish and fruit and cake or whatever, that's even more of a sinner.
What about somebody who just stops drinking wine?
Again, what it seems to be suggesting is that there, on some level, that God created the world for our enjoyment. Right? In other words, like there's a story which I think is true. I have no reason to believe it's not true, but they say that Rav Shimshon Hirsch, before he died, he was late in his life. He went to visit the Alps, and they said, I guess it was not so easy to get there. Whatever it is, how can we go in there? And he said that when I get up to Shamayim, God's going to say, Shimshon, did you see my Alps? In other words, I think a basic idea, unless we believe, that God created everything in the world beautiful and that's enjoyable as the Yetzer Hara, the basic idea is that God created for us to enjoy it. So why would a person not drink wine? What's wrong with wine? Right? I mean, obviously, you don't want to be a drunk, you don't want to be disgusting about it, but again, the Nazir is not saying, okay, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to be a alcoholic. He doesn't have anything, right? He doesn't have grapes, seeds, he doesn't have anything. So this approach seems to say that he's doing a sin. He's actually, holding back from something which God said is fine. And then it says, Rabbi Elazar Omer Nikra Kadosh. This is a very famous machlokes. No, he's actually called holy. So again, we start to see some of this. Chazal are not really sure what to make of this guy. Some of them see him as, unnecessarily taking upon himself things that, making things asur which aren't asur. And others say that no, it's actually a positive thing, kadosh. It's actually he wants to reach a higher level. Okay, that's one example. Or let's see, another example. Again, these are just various mamrei Chazal which give a little bit of a sense of that they're really, they're very conflicted about how to read this. And again, as Robert Alter pointed out, it's not so clear from the pasuk. Is it a good thing? Well, I've got a real party going on here. So it says here. This is from Lekach Tov, which is a sefer of midrashim. And so it's answering the question. And again, I think this is a question you could ask. Also, what is this even doing over here? In other words, the beginning of Parsha of Sefer Bamidbar is all about Bnei Yisrael kind of getting ready to go into Eretz Yisrael, right? In other words, there's no 40 years, there's no problems. They're starting to count them. They're starting to talk about how they're going to travel, how they're going to camp when they're traveling, how they're going to fight, the Chatzotzrot, how they're going to follow God's word. And you have a couple of these things in here which are very, very strange. So Taz here, which, okay, I think we could give an answer to that also, but why is the Nazir in the middle of this? In other words, why, if the beginning of Bamidbar is the plan for how they're going to get to Eretz Yisrael, why is it here? And I think there's a maybe at the end we'll come back to this, but at least one approach kind of looks at it and says, well, what comes next to it? Right? One approach says, okay, it follows after sotah. This is, for a person who wants to learn what happened to the sotah, they want to be more careful. Okay? But he's actually asking another question, right? Because right after the story, right after the halachot of the Nazir, that's where we have Birkat Kohanim, where Aaron and his sons bless Bnei Israel. So Midrash says, Lama nismacha parsha zo leparshat Kohanim. Why is this parsha connected to Parshat Kohanim? Lefisha kedushat Nazir kedushat Kohen Gadol. The holiness of the Nazir is like the holiness of a Kohen Gadol. Okay, that's pretty positive. In other words, beforehand we said that a Nazir is someone who's sinning, right? Here we have a Midrash which says he's like the Kohen Gadol. Okay, here's another one. Going back a little bit earlier. It was nice. I couldn't sleep last night, so like at about 2:20 I went downstairs. I was sitting on the couch in shorts and t-shirt, just like going through the Torah Shlema and just trying to find different ideas on the Midrash, trying to think things through. So here, Tar lo yavor al rosho. This is from Bamidbar Rabbah. Lama tiva Kadosh Baruch Hu Nazir shelo yigaleach rosho. Why did God command that a Nazir should not cut his hair? Lefisha giluach mitaro miyafo kashem shamro biyosef. Because why do we get our hair cut? Says the guy who hasn't had his hair cut in 2 months. Right? Why do we do it? Because we want to look nice. Right? A person gets their hair cut. They want to look nice. Right? Where do we see that in the Torah? By Yosef, right? Yosef HaTzadik, right? After he's been in the pit, right? He's been in jail or whatever, in some hole in the ground in Egypt, and now he's being brought before Paro. What does it say? V'yigaleach v'yichalef simlotav. Right? They shaved him. They cut. So in other words, it's you're going to appear before a king. You don't go without a haircut for months and months, right? So. The gidul sa'ar hu lashon sa'ar ve'evel, right? And when does a person let their hair grow long? When you're in avel, right? When a person's in mourning for a parent, for an immediate relative, you let your hair grow long. Hair growing long. Yes, you have modern idea of but in general, in general, when men were men, you kept your hair short. If your hair was long, it meant that you were a mourner. So lekach amar Kadosh Baruch Hu achar shezeh hanazir asar atzmo min hayayin. Since he already separated himself from wine, kadei laharchik atzmo min hazima, he wants to keep himself away from sexual immorality, which again is putting a positive spin on it. Yigadel se'aro she'itnavel v'yitzta'er kadei shelo yehei yitzer hara kofetz alav. So as part of that, if you want to stay away from, the party scene. Right? In other words, if you want to, if you're a person who wants to stay away from parties, and we'll come to a big example of this in a moment. But you want to, you want to make sure that the only love you ever experience with a woman is the woman you marry, and you don't want to have you're at Binghamton University. I don't know why that comes to example with not that I think about any students, but you're and you want to make sure that you don't get involved in the whole party scene there. So what do? So first of all, you swear off wine, which might be a good start, and then you also God says, okay, let your hair grow also, because if you look like a bum, the ladies aren't going to want to hang out with you. Right. Okay, right. So again, so it's saying that at least, this seems to suggest that part of the strategy is this idea about removing yourself from the Yetzer Hara, right? That you're not being involved in wine and making yourself look nice. Again, another approach. Okay, one more, and then I'll open up the Gemara. One of the most interesting Gemara on this. Here it says, I think it wrote Sadi Bey, let me see. Right, so it says, Ki Nezer Elokav al Rosho, because he has the crown of God upon his head, which is one of the meanings of the word Nazir. Nazir is a crown. Right, come and see that whoever tries to make themselves holy, putting in their own effort, God makes them holy. Zel fisha mezir atzmo min hayayin v'nohet tsar ba'atzmo shelo yigalech rosho kedei lishmor atzmo min avayra. Similar to what we just said, right? He's not drinking wine and he's not cutting his hair to keep himself from doing avirot. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu harehu choshev hashuv lefanai kohen gadol. This guy, God says, by this guy making these efforts to be removed from the rest of, from the Yetzer Hara, he's like a kohen gadol. Ma Kohen, right? So it's saying, in other words, what is the act that the guy is doing on his own? not cutting his hair, not drinking his wine. What's the result of that? He becomes like the Kohen Gadol, and therefore, Ma Kohen Asur li tamei l'chol hametim, af Nazir asur li tamei l'chol hametim. Right? Just like a Kohen cannot become tamei for almost anyone, so same thing with a Nazir. Ma Kohen Gadol, right, can't become. He has the nezer of oil upon his head. So too, he also has a nezer upon his head. So again, this is making it a very positive thing. And again, so we have this back and forth. Is it negative that you're holding back from enjoying yourself? I mean, dude, God gave you wine. Knock yourself out. Well, I mean, within reason. Or is it a negative thing? So let's look at one more Gemara. This is in Masechet Nedarim. It drives me crazy. I mean, one of the problems when you prepare a shiur at 2:30 in the morning is that the next morning when you try to remember what you read. So I knew it was on Daf. I knew it was on Daf Tet. And I was looking in Nazir and I could not find it. And then thanks to a Google search, I discovered that it was a Daf Tet in Masechet Nedarim and not in Masechet Nazir. So So I guess there are some. So here's a very, very interesting one over here. So it says, Amar Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik says, Miyamai lo achalti asham nazir mitamei, asham nazir tamei, ela achad. Right? In other words, one of the things that a nazir has to bring, he has to bring a korban asham. Right, guilt offering, which the Kohen would eat. So Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik said he never ate from it except for once. Pam achat ba adam achad Nazir min hadarom. A certain Nazir came from the south. Uraitiv shehu yifat einayim v'tov roi. And I v'kvutzotav sedurot lo taltalim. Right, I saw this guy, and this guy, he was a dude. I mean, he was like, he had beautiful eyes, and he was good looking, and he had curly hair. I mean, this guy, the ladies would have loved him. But he was a Nazir. Amarti lo b'ni, mara ita hashrod tzarcha. Like, dude, you're gorgeous. Why are you letting your hair grow long and mess it all up? Amar li. So he said to me, Ro'eh hayiti la'aba be'iri. So I was a shepherd. Halachti l'malot mayim min hamayan. I went to fill up water from the well. V'nistakalti b'vuah shali, and I saw my reflection. V'pitu alai yitzrai, and I started thinking to myself, damn, I'm good looking. Right? Ubikesh the tordena min olam, right? And that could destroy me from the entire world, right? You can spend the rest of your life, when you're this gorgeous person, you can spend the rest of your life just like, the ladies are going to run after you, and you can destroy your neshama. So he was going to destroy him from the world. So amarti lo. So I said to my reflection, Rasha. Or maybe, okay? Lama atam mitna'eh ba'olam she'eno shalcha. What are you getting so proud of yourself in a world that's not yours? B'mishu atid liot rima v'tolat. Right? Like, think about it, dude. You might think you're really good looking now, but one day you're just going to be worm food. Ha'avudah she'agalcheh l'shamayim. He said, therefore I accepted upon myself to be a Nazir, right? In other words, he realized that, he realized he was incredibly good looking, and he could have just partied for the rest of his life and thrown his entire spiritual existence away, and therefore he decided to become a Nazir. And it says, Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik kissed him. So again, this is it's an idea. This is sort of like an in-between situation. It's not really, really positive. Because in other words, again, it's not saying everybody should do this, but it's saying, but if you're in a situation where potentially, you want, again, like that thing, imagine, it's a guy who realizes that if I want to, I can just, I can totally follow my Yetzer Hara. I live in a world where, a combination of what I have and what's around me, I can do whatever I want. It's a pull. It's all right. It's a very strong pull. So in other words, again, this seems to suggest that not that being a Nazir is inherently a positive thing for anybody, but if you're a person who wants to make sure you're not going to, that your Yetzer HaTov is going to be victorious, this might be a way of sort of pulling yourself away from that, kind of stacking the deck a little bit. In other words, there's no mitzvah. It's an important thing to realize, there's no mitzvah to Like, let's say with a diet, right? In other words, that person wants to lose weight. So, yeah, it might be, there might be something about showing willpower, if you're in a house with all sorts of great food and you don't eat. But if you tie yourself to the sofa, or you have someone tie you to the sofa so you can't move, and then you don't eat any unhealthy food, you still lose weight. It's the same thing. In other words, like, yeah, it might be nice if a person, sometimes you might fool yourself and think, oh, I don't need to, do anything to let my Yetzer Hatov win. I'm just going to let it win. But a person might realize, I need to bring in the troops. I need a little bit of extra help. So, again, it's sort of, Chazal put it in this, it's certainly not an ideal for everyone, right? In other words, you're keeping yourself away from God's creation. There is something, Kohen Gadol-like, but maybe only for a person who needs it. So let's take that a little bit, further. So, in Tivot Shalom, we quoted him last week, he actually points out a very interesting, actually, one more thing before we get there. One more thing that I thought was very interesting, right? Another thing that Chazal say, right? A person can, in theory, be a Nazir for their entire life, right? Like Shimshon, although there's a question whether Shimshon really was fully a Nazir, because he never took it upon himself. But, right, there's an idea also that there's a minimum amount of time that you could be a Nazir. Which I guess makes sense, because, like, if I say, okay, I'm a Nazir for the next 10 minutes. I'm going to let my hair grow really long for the next 10. So in other words, it makes sense that there would be some sort of a set amount of minimum time that would at least on some level potentially be an amount of time where it's a challenge upon yourself not to get your hair cut. It's a challenge not to become tamei. It's a challenge not to drink wine. Right? So the number that Chazal mentioned is 30 days. And if you look, there's really quite a number of explanations that try to get to where do we get 30 days from. Right? It's like one of these things. In other words, I was like talking to my daughter about this year, and I said, like, in general, you don't have a big machloket. Where do you get that Shabbat is on the seventh day? Let's try this drasha, let's try this proof. There's something about the fact that it's saying that it's 30 days and that you have all these different ideas. It's clear that it's not pshat in the Torah, because the Torah itself does not mention this amount of time. But it's interesting, Chazal bring a number of different proofs, but two of them really struck me. Two of them are connected to Avelut, which I think means something. Right? It says... Here it says, Kol Yemei Naziro, V'yivku b'nei Yisrael et Moshe ba'arvot Moav shloshim yom. Right? B'nei Yisrael mourned for Moshe after he died. This is at the end of Sefer Dvarim for 30 days. V'yitamu Yemei b'chi, and the days of crying were over. And they make a Gzeirah Shavah. U'minayin liyemei Nazirut shehem shloshim yom. And where do we get that? It's 30 days for a Nazir, the minimum for a Nazir. Ne'emar kan Yemei and V'nemar lahalan Yemei. Right? It says here by mourning for Moshe 30 days, and it says by the Nazir Yemei Naziro. So, right, just like Yemei here means 30 days, so too there means 30 days. Now, one of the things Rabbi Walicki, right, was Sammy's one of his Rosh Yeshiva, told me I think a very, very important idea, right? Like, Gzeirah Shavah should drive us crazy. Oh, there's one word over here and there's one word over there. It must be. And what he pointed out, I think this is Reuven Margolios, I think, talks about this, is that they're trying to connect ideas. In other words, you're not just taking any two random psukim, but there's a conceptual connection between the two of them. So again, it's saying that there's something similar, and we'll try to flesh this out in a little bit, connected to Avelut and to being a Nazir. There's something which we'll try to flesh that out. Right? Another place here, it's from a different source connected to Avelut, but still Avelut. Which again, the fact that it appears two times leads me to believe that that's not a coincidence. It says the Gemara says, this is from the Masechet Yerushalmi. It says Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Right? Where do we get it from? It says by an Isha Yefat Toar, right? When the guy goes off to war, one of these really, really weird halachot. It's not the most PC halacha at all, but a man, under certain circumstances, during war, he was allowed to take a woman as a captive, and maybe either sleep with her at that point, or maybe after a certain time period, but he could bring her back, and assuming that, after a whole time period where he allowed her to cry for, being, that she was going to, leave her family and way behind, he was allowed to marry her. Okay, very, very, it's certainly worthy of its own shiur. But what does it say there? Ubachta et avia vet ima yerach yamim. And we allow her to cry for for her father and mother for yerach yamim, a month's worth of days, 30 days. Ma yamim shneimar lahalan shloshim yom, af yamim shneimar kan ad mlo yamim. Right, so to here, the word yamim by a Nazir means 30 days. Again, she's crying. There's some sort of like a mourning process that's taking place. So again, the 30 days, and again, there's all sorts of other explanation, but the fact that two of these drashot are connected to this idea of mourning, I think that's going to key us into something, which is where hopefully where I'm going to get at the end. So the Nazir Shalom points out something very interesting. Right, as you can imagine, the Rambam, you would imagine, the whole idea of being a Nazir would be kind of strange to someone who was very into philosophy. The idea of taking on all these unnecessary things. Right, and in fact, if we look in one place in the Rambam, in Hilchot Deot, right, the proper behaviors, proper ideas that a person should have. That's right at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. So this is Perek Gimel Halacha Aleph. Shema Yomar Adam. Perhaps a person will say, Ho'il v'kin'a v'tava v'kavod kiyotze behem derech ra'ahin. Right, since jealousy and following, all your desires and kavod is a bad thing, maybe he'll say, Efrosh behem biyoter v'itrachek l'tzad acharon. You know what? I'm going to stay away from all this. Anything, I'm going to totally avoid any temptation. Ad shelo yochal basar, I'm not going to eat red meat, or meat. V'lo yishteh yayin, and I'm not going to drink wine. V'lo yisa isha, and I'm not going to marry a woman. Sex is bad too. V'lo yishev b'dirana, I'm not going to live in a nice place, and nice clothes. And he goes through all these examples. Gam zeh derech ra'ahi, v'asur leilechba. This is a bad way. A person who goes to an extreme is called a sinner. Sounds like that's what he would say about a Nazir. Right here he says it right away. Right? Why is that? What's the sin of the Nazir? That he moves away from. And again, right, the Rambam, very famous concept, Shvil HaZahav. You take the middle road. Right, you don't go to extremes. I'm worried. That I might Yitzhar Haras. I'm going to not have wine. I'm not going to have meat. I'm going to, the idea of, at least for the Rambam. I mean, there certainly were Rishonim who would disagree. At least for the Rambam, living this very ascetic lifestyle is not true. You're supposed to live this middle path. So it makes it sound like for the Rambam, being a Nazir, accepting upon yourself to stay away from all this temptation is a bad thing. And yet, shortly, not shortly, but later on in. The Rambam says something very different, right? This is in Hilchot Nedarim, towards the end of, towards the end of Hilchot Nedarim. This is Perek Yud Gimel, Halacha Chav Gimel. So listen to what the Rambam says over here. Misha Nadar Nedarim Kedei Lechonein Da'otav L'Takein Ma'asav. Someone who makes a vow in order to make sure that his beliefs and his actions and are good. Hareze Zariza Mishabach. It's a good thing to take vows upon yourself to make sure that you end up in the right place. Ketzad Kagon Misha Yazolel V'asar Alav Habasar Shana Shnataim. Guy is a pig, right? He's just a guy who totally stuffs his face. So he says, you know what? I'm going to stay away from meat. I'm going to take a vow not to have meat for the next 2 years. Again, he's not temporarily. He's trying to kind of pull himself back towards the middle, right? Mishaya Shogeh B'Yayin V'Asar Yayin Atzmo. Or a guy who was like the town drunk, and accepted upon himself not to drink wine. Asar Hashikrut La'olam, or a guy who accepted upon himself not to become drunk. These are all good things for the Rambam. So, the simple thing is, what does it depend upon? It depends on where you are. For a person who doesn't need it, for the average person who life is in balance, right? What would the Rambam say? Don't go beyond what God says. God gives you the mitzvot themselves are in order to keep you in line. Don't be crazy, you're going to go further away from wine than what from God said. God said you can't sleep with other women, I'm not even going to sleep with my wife. God said you can't eat, too much meat, I'm not going to eat. No, for the average person, but then there's the other person, right? The famous example the Rambam says, right? You're supposed to stay in the middle, but sometimes if you end up in one extreme, how do you get back to the middle? It's like a wire, right? You go all the way to the other side, and then at a certain point, it swings back to the middle. Right? So it seems to be that it really depends on where you are. In other words, what the Rambam seems to be saying, and this sort of falls in line with what we saw in some of the Gemarot, is that it's not an ideal. It really is just for a certain person it's necessary. So now the Netivot Shalom, he says, he points out something very, very interesting. He says that really when it comes to the physical world in general, food and drink and sex and clothes and nice houses and all those kind of things, so there's really like different levels that a person could have. Right? You could have, pre-shoot. Right? A person can say, you know what? I'm not sure I can handle these things so well, and once I start, it might not end up well. I'm going to stay away from it. Right? Or a person, the middle level might be, I'm going to be l'shem shamayim with what I have. Right? I'm going to eat. I'm going to, have a nice car. I'm going to have a nice house. But I'll keep God in mind. And then a higher level is to really be makadesh everything. That everything you have physical just becomes another part of your relationship with God. Right? It's not just I'm going to use those things and keep God in mind, but in other words, a person who's like really, really on a high madriga, they can reach a point where everything is part of serving God. So he says that there's really different levels. So it occurred to me, and here's where I'm going to try to get into my own idea. We mentioned that there's 3 different korbanot that are given, right? A chatat, a shlamim, and olah at the end. So there's this great website. If you get a chance, it's fantastic. They have these animated videos, 10 minutes long, absolutely fantastic. It's called Aleph Beta, not Beta, but Beta. It's actually Rabbi David Foreman. I taught his daughters a bunch of years ago. Fantastic stuff. So he points out we actually used it. A lot of schools are starting to use this. We actually used it at Noam when I was teaching there. And there were a couple of times where he developed this theme, to the point where my students used to go, "Oh, again?" And I'd say, "No, he's giving you such an important point." Right? He said, he explained the way the korbanot work. Right? A korban chatat. Right? He said a korban chatat, and this is going to be significant, ties back to the original sin. Right? A friend of mine once said to me, this guy I know, he said, well, it might not be, we're not Christians when it comes to the idea of original sin, but clearly the sin of Adam and Chava, it really represents something very, very major. Right? And what was the idea of the sin? God basically puts Adam and Chava in this garden and says, you can eat from all the trees, but there's one tree that's mine. There's one tree, don't do it. And what happens? They take from it. They lose that line. They lose that boundary. Right? So, in other words, a chait, right? Rabbi Foreman suggests that every chait, right, and is really this idea of not respecting. In other words, God gives you what's yours, and God has what's His, and not respecting it. So, a korban chatat is sort of a recognition for a person who realizes that they don't have the right, they've made use of what God, what is God's for a different thing. So this is sort of like the idea that he's saying in terms of pre-shoot. That in other words, like one of the things that we have to respect is kind of like the boundary of what's mine and what's not mine. Right? In other words, a person might, reach a point, and kind of, have to struggle. That's one idea. Right? Then there's the shlamim. Right, the shlamim is the peace offering, the wholeness offering, right? That you take what's yours and you make it also God's, right? In other words, it's shalom. It's not shalom just peace, but it's like a whole. In other words, what happens? Who gets to eat from shlamim? The Baal gets to eat some, the one who gives it. Some of it goes up on the Mizbeach, and some of it goes to the Kohanim, who are the representatives of God. Right? That's like this middle level that the Netivot Shalom mentioned, being L'Shem Shamayim. That, I have what's mine, and God has what's His, and I try to make sure that I respect both sides of it. Right? Then you have this last level of the Korban Olah. What's a Korban Olah? Korban Olah is when the classic example he points out is with Akedah Yitzchak. Right? That you take, at a certain point, you realize your relation with God is so overwhelming that you want to give over everything. You realize that God, everything I have really belongs to you. Right? And what's the ultimate example? To the point where Abraham is ready to give up his own son. Right? And that's why, when we mentioned before, Robert Alter, the idea that, you want to give of your own body to God. Now, we're not going to go give a korban, I have two arms, I may as well cut off the left one, I'm a righty anyway. But in other words, again, maybe that's the idea of having this korban that involves taking some of yourself, even if it's just your hair, for those of us who still have it left, and giving it as a korban. So you have these 3 basic ideas over here. But I think we could take this a little bit further. It occurred to me last night, and the good old Facebook Beit Midrash, I posted this and I got some very interesting responses. It occurred to me last night, and I couldn't prove it at first, although I had some ideas. So again, we're talking about detective work. Okay, so you can't have wine. Well, what do we know about wine? So there's a Gemara in Masechet Brachot. on Daf Mem Amud Aleph, and we're almost done over here. Let me see if I can find this. Wow, it's always that reminder each week that I'm getting old as my eyes. All right, whatever. I can't find the words. I can't find it right now inside, I think. Not a big deal. Here we are, actually. So, famous, whenever we look at the pictures, the paintings and not the pictures, we don't have photographs, Adam and Chava eating from the Eitz Hadat, right? But it's always a picture of an apple. But if you look, Chazal actually ask what was it. Now, the truth is we don't know, and it doesn't really matter. God doesn't tell us. But midrashically, they ask. They say, so, Ilan shachal mimenu Adam harishon, Rabbi Meir omer gefen haya. It was grapes. Right? Why?
It's Eitz Hadat.
Yeah. Right? And she'en lecha davar shemevi yilala al Adam ela yayin. There's nothing that brings tragedy to the world more than wine, right? Person becomes, an alcoholic. They could lose everything. Shneimar, and he brings a pasuk from Noach, vayesh min hayayin vishaker, and he became drunk. And then there's other possibilities. Maybe it was a fig, maybe it was wheat. Whoa, wheat, okay, however we get to that. Maybe it was an etrog, different possibilities. But Reb Meir suggests that it's grapes. In other words, the original sin, the sin of the Eitz Hadat, came from drinking wine. Right? And what was the punishment of the Eitz Hadat for eating from the Eitz Hadat? What was introduced into the world? Death. Right? So I was thinking to myself, okay, so you have this idea, stay away from wine, stay away from and all grape products, stay away from death. What is the Nazir really about? I think it's really about an attempt to go back to the status of like Adam and Chava before the sin. That it's this an attempt to kind of go to to make up for it. And that's the idea of kapara, that you're going back to the original sin and you're going to make up for it. In other words, if it's wine that led to mankind kind of falling from this place of da'at. So Rabbi Ari Khan, I asked, does anybody say this? Because I'm a little bit of a wimp when it comes to these things. I don't know if I want to say my own idea. If no one else connected to it said that. So the Sfat Emet, the Sfas Emes, the Ger Rebbe, who a lot of times I don't get what he's saying. It just I like Chassid. For some reason I've always struggled to really get the Sfas Emes, but the Sfas Emes actually says this. So I not exactly the way I'm putting it, but so again, you have this idea of trying to stay away from death, which is their sin didn't allow them to do that, and staying away from wine. Then I was thinking to myself, okay, so where are you a little stuck? So you're stuck a little bit with the idea of hair, right? There's no real destruction. There's no discussion there of hair. So here, maybe I'm going to stretch it a little bit, but I think there's something to this. If you look at the original, if you look where it talks about the sin of the Eitz Hadat, right? So you have the whole conversation between the snake and the woman. And the snake's trying to get her to eat it, and he says, you're not going to die. God knows, Yodea Elokim, God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you're going to be like God, Yodea Tov Ra. Now, listen to how it describes what the woman is. Vatera Isha, Ki Tov Ha'et Lamachal, it is good to eat. V'chi Ta'avahu Le'inayim, it is... taiva is usually like sexual desire, but it's desirous to the eyes. V'nechmad ha'etz lahaskil, and it's again lachmod is to crave, and craving to think about it. Again, it's this very physical. It's this very sensual kind of language, almost like that. Again, there was something. It was introducing to some degree a Yetzer Hara into the world. There was some degree to which this pull towards physicality, towards lo tachmod, don't commit adultery, and ta'ava towards ta'avot. There's something about that this world can pull us towards these things very easily. So maybe on some level, and maybe this is a stretch, maybe not, I don't know, but maybe the idea of not cutting your hair, if it represents what we said before, this idea of kind of pulling back a little bit. In other words, maybe if the original chait involved being drawn in by your eyes, being pulled by your Yitzhar towards a world of sensuality and desire, then maybe the idea of letting your hair grow and kind of making it so that you're not going to make that a central idea. So it seems to me, and again, with a little help from the Sfas Emes, it seems to me that that's really what's going on here. That's the kapara. That in other words, the person is really trying to make up for the sin of Adam Arishon. They're trying to stay away from the fruit that led to it. They're trying to stay away from death, which is what their first sin brought in, and they're trying to stay away from their Yetzer Hara controlling their lives. And in fact, I also thought about, right, we mentioned before that the word Nazir, Nun Zayin Resh, actually is a crown, right? What does it say? It says when they got to and this is what we spoke about last week with Na'aseh v'Nishma, when they got to Har Sinai, remember we said that the angels, Malachim, brought down crowns upon their head? Right? In other words, that and of course they lost it afterwards. But again, same thing. It says that by Har Sinai also, they were going back to that original state. So I think that the Nazir is this attempt to kind of try to go back to who man really could have been had we not given in to all these weaknesses that we have. And I think maybe this also explains why this appears over here. In other words, we said that in terms of, they're heading into Eretz Yisrael and they've got all these things, how they're going to camp by the Shvatim and where they're going to go and how they're going to fight and how they're going to line up. And again, if they're going to be successful, if they're going to go into Eretz Yisrael, it's not just a question of what's the battle plan and how are you physically going to get there, but in other words, what's the lifestyle that you're supposed to live? In other words, going to Israel is not supposed to just be like, woohoo, party, we've made it, but it's supposed to, I think, bring you to this higher spiritual state. It's supposed to be this unique opportunity to really reach this high state. And I think the idea of the Nazir, the idea of going back to the original sin and making up for that, part of that, if they really were going to be successful, and of course in the second half of Bamidbar they're not, but if they're really going to go back to being successful, they're going to be successful in Eretz Yisrael, it was not just going to be about getting there, but it was going to be about getting to really where they're supposed to be. And just to wrap things up, I don't think I've ever heard of him. I've gotten very into Rav Kook recently. I've been having some interesting conversation with this rabbi who's really like one of the big experts in the world on Rav Kook. Rav Kook had a number of these like very close talmidim, and one of them was this Rav David Cohen. Rav David Cohen was a Nazir, and I actually found out there's a whole website. Not that he started. I mean, he's been gone since way before there was internet. But there's a whole website dedicated to his Torah and to his ideas. Over the next few days, I'm going to hopefully get a chance to look through it. But I was like really curious, like, what made him become a Nazir? I mean, he was this yeshiva student from Lithuania. He ended up in Switzerland, and then again somehow Rav Kook during World War I, he was fundraising for his yeshiva. Then he got before World War I, and he got stuck in Europe during World War I because the war broke out and he couldn't get back to Palestine. And he meets up with Rav David Cohen, and Rav David Cohen had been studying philosophy in a Swiss university, and he became attached to Rav Kook, and ultimately he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and he becomes a Nazir. And I was wondering to myself, like, what's it about? Like, why does somebody take that on? And he's a very, very complicated, interesting person. I mean, I think, and this website, I think, is going to be very interesting to look through. He, I had known this before. He took upon himself a ta'anit dibur. Right? He would literally not speak each year from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur. 40 days. I mean, I can't go 40 seconds without talking. I mean, every year, 40 days. And another thing, which I had not seen elsewhere, but I've heard this a bunch of times, they say, and I'd like to confirm this, they say that, 1948, when the old city of Yerushalayim was, fell into the Jordanian hands, they say that he basically accepted upon himself that he was going to stay in his house until they got it back. And I think, again, assuming the story is true, from 1948 to 1967, he did not leave his house, or maybe very rarely. I don't know the specific details. They say that in 1967, when Harabayit, the famous, Harabayit Biadenu, Rav Goren, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, was one of the chief rabbis. He actually, the first thing he did when he got there is he actually sent an army jeep to the Nazir's house so he could bring him over, so he could, come say a Shachianu on seeing the Kotel. Very complicated person. I was wondering, like, what does it mean? Why does a person become a Nazir these days? Especially, it's not a 30-day being a Nazir. I mean, the only way you could stop being a Nazir, you have to be able to bring all these korbanot. The only way you could be a Nazir these days is if you sign on the dotted line forever. I mean, you can cut your hair once a year. I mean, you can't become tamei for anyone. Like, why would someone take that on? So, it is very interesting. The Nazir, again, was a really very creative thinker, and I have barely learned anything of his. So I wouldn't want to pretend that I know more about him than I do. But the Nazir, he saw it first of all as like a level of bringing back nivuah. He actually, this is a big idea that many who are into mysticism over the centuries have tried to do in Tzfat. There was a sense of, maybe we're not done being able to communicate with God to this level. And I was thinking that maybe, and he said, to some degree, he wanted to bring the idea of being a Nazir back to the world. But I was thinking that maybe what I'm saying is correct, that really the idea of being a Nazir is this attempt to go back to Gan Eden, then maybe the idea of connecting that to being a Navi is not so far off, right? In other words, we see that the relationship of Adam and Chava was this intimate, close relationship with God, where they were able to communicate right away, where there was, the voice of God they interacted with right away. And I'm thinking, so maybe these things, tie in that maybe, that in other words, if we want to go back to this closer relationship with God, whether it's about Nivuah, whether it's about, the Beit HaMikdash, Mashiach, whatever it is, then I think the Nazir, well, again, whether or not we actually want to be a Nazir or not, but I think this idea of recognizing, of recognizing again that, it's sort of like a going above and beyond to say that, you're right, God didn't say we can't do this, and maybe I don't have to do this, and I can aim for being an average, solid Jew, and that's a very nice thing, that's a very high level. But in other words, the idea of Nazir at least reminds us of this idea that we have the ability to not just kind of take the regular, the basic package, you get the car, you've got the roll down windows, you've got, but you want all the extras, the preset mirrors and all the things like that. In other words, even when it comes to Torah, that there's like this higher package we could sign up for, that the idea of being a Nazir gives us this opportunity to reach not just for being on a regular level, but kind of going back to the, the idea of, the level of Adam and Chava and to the level of Nivuah. And with that, I bid you a Shabbat Shalom.